Did you know that just one news headline can make an entire nation's currency tumble like dominoes? Why will 1 USD never equal 1 euro or 1 GBP? And who is truly pricing the thing we call trust?
Watch this entire video and you'll understand all this complexity in an extremely simple way.
1. Exchange rates, the price tag of trust.
The core issue is that the quote-unquote exchange rate is simply the price of quote-unquote one currency when traded for another at the same moment. Imagine Marco Polo walking into an Eastern marketplace, and the first thing he needs to do is exchange his money based on the exchange rate. When you exchange money, you aren't just trading paper. You're trading the level of credibility of two economies. In the foreign exchange market, every trade is a vote for value. If many people want to buy a certain currency, demand rises and its price increases. If many people want to sell a currency due to risk aversion, supply increases and its price drops. Macroeconomic news makes expectations shift color in just minutes. Shifting expectations make money flow like water, and exchange rates jump like a clock hand that someone has flicked hard. Sometimes a currency strengthens, not because the country got richer in one day, but because risk elsewhere increased in 1 hour. Therefore, read exchange rates like reading a global confidence poll. In short, the exchange rate is the price tag of confidence and risk, not a random number. 2. Money, the social contract. The big question is why a piece of paper can be traded for a meal, and the answer lies in one social contract. Thomas Jefferson understood that the strength of a nation lay in the institutions that generated trust. A currency holds value because it is accepted for paying debts, salaries, and especially for paying, quote, taxes. When the state collects taxes in that currency, it creates the fundamental demand for, quote, money. When economic contracts list prices in that currency, it becomes the common language of accounting. When the legal system protects property rights, people dare to hold on to money longer. If institutions are unstable, people flee to other assets to preserve, quote, value. What keeps the currency stable is not the ink used, but the, quote, discipline of the entire system. In short, money is a social contract signed by collective confidence. 3. The gold standard, the chain of discipline. A historical turning point was when many nations pegged their money to gold to keep, quote, one promise of scarcity. Isaac Newton, while working at the Mint, understood that a metallic standard helped control monetary, quote, discipline. If money is convertible to gold, the government cannot print indefinitely without being exposed by the amount in the gold reserves. This kept inflation expectations low because people believed the money supply was limited by, quote-unquote, physics. But during war or crisis, the economy needs liquidity faster than, quote-unquote, one world's ability to mine gold. When liquidity is scarce, credit contracts, and growth easily stalls. In other words, the gold standard was good for discipline, but could be bad for, quote, flexibility. That's why many countries abandoned the gold standard. Not because they hated gold, but because they needed tools to put out crises. In short, the quote-unquote gold standard is a chain of discipline, and a chain sometimes makes you run slower. 4. Fiat money, signed confidence. When they left gold, the world moved deeper into fiat money, where value exists because of one legal declaration. Alexander Hamilton built the American financial foundation by prioritizing debt repayment to solidify, quote, trust. Fiat money thrives on taxes because taxes create mandatory demand for, quote, money. Fiat money thrives on law because the law makes it the default payment instrument for, quote, contracts. Fiat money thrives on the banking system because banks turn savings into credit and maintain the flow. Fiat money thrives on expectation because if people believe they can still buy goods tomorrow, they will accept money today. The funny thing is, many people call fiat worthless paper. But what's truly messy is the mindset of wanting to get rich using the printing press. In short, fiat money is trust backed by law, taxation, and policy discipline. 5. Inflation, the invisible corroder. The nature of inflation is when purchasing power decreases, and the same one amount of money buys fewer goods. Marie Curie understood that only by measuring radioactivity could danger be controlled, and inflation also needs to be measured using an index. Inflation can stem from demand growing faster than supply, from rising input costs, or from self-amplifying expectations. If people believe prices will rise, they buy sooner, increasing demand, and prices rise exactly according to the quote-unquote prophecy. If businesses believe prices will rise, they raise prices preemptively for self-protection, making the quote-unquote spiral stronger. If the state finances deficits by injecting the money supply too quickly, goods cannot increase fast enough, and prices must rise to balance supply and demand. Holding cash in a high inflation environment is like holding ice cream at noon and praying for the temperature to drop. But low and stable inflation sometimes helps the economy avoid falling into deflation and stagnation. In short, inflation doesn't kill you with a knife. It nibbles away at purchasing power steadily, like constant drizzle. 6. Interest rates, the capital magnet. The nature of the interest rate is the price of credit and the compensation for risk. So just one small change can reverse capital flow. Paul Volcker famously used high interest rates to squash inflation and restore market confidence. When real interest rates are attractive, investors buy bonds and need to purchase that currency, causing foreign exchange demand to rise. When demand rises, the currency strengthens, and the exchange rate reacts like a quote-unquote censor. However, there are two layers to distinguish: policy rates and market rates within the same quote-unquote one economy. The central bank strongly influences short-term interest rates, but long-term rates are also determined by expectations and risk. If the market fears future instability, they demand high yields even if policy rates are low because they are pricing in, quote, uncertainty. The flip side is that high interest rates make borrowing expensive, slow down consumption, and reduce growth following the momentum. In short, interest rates are the volume knob of the economy. Turn it too high, and everything goes silent due to recession. 7. Stability, the confidence premium. A currency's value depends on the level of institutional stability, because investors only need one legal shock to lose sleep. Deng Xiaoping proved that institutional reform can turn expectations into capital flows and increase, quote, credibility. When the rules of the game are clear and assets are protected, people dare to hold money and assets domestically longer. When the rules are ambiguous, people demand risk compensation and sell that currency cheaper via the, quote, exchange rate. High public debt and prolonged deficits make the market worry about repayment capacity and, quote, inflation. Political instability worsens expectations, and bad expectations weaken the currency through that quote-unquote mechanism. Stability doesn't mean no change, but rather change that is predictable and guided by, quote, discipline. In short, stability is what allows a currency to stand firm through a storm without having to shout loudly. 8. The balance of payments, the flow of goods. A critical pillar of the exchange rate is the balance of trade, because imports and exports create, quote, one real flow of foreign currency. Henry Ford understood the power of mass production, and that power often draws demand for the producer nation's currency. When a country exports heavily, buyers need that country's currency for payment, increasing demand according to the transaction. When a country imports heavily, they must sell their own currency to buy foreign currency, increasing supply according to need. However, trade isn't the only story, as services and capital flows also impact the, quote, exchange rate. A country can run a trade deficit but still maintain a strong currency if it attracts investment capital and has a deep financial market. The crucial thing is to understand that every shipping container of goods trails foreign exchange like a shadow. In short, the trade balance is the real push, while expectation is the psychological push. 9. The petrodollar, the network effect. The petrodollar concept describes how oil is typically priced and paid for in USD, creating reserve demand based on habit. Richard Nixon's pivot in 1971 moved the world further away from gold and increased the role of, quote, fiat currency. When a strategic commodity uses one currency as its unit, many nations accumulate that currency to reduce settlement risk. The more people use a unit, the more convenient it is. And the more convenient it is, the more it is used based on the quote-unquote network. This role is further reinforced by the deep financial markets and high convertibility of the quote-unquote USD. But don't turn this concept into a mystical theory, because it is a structure of habit and utility that can change. As payment systems diversify, the network power can dissipate according to trends. In short, the petrodollar is a story about networks, not magic. 10. Currency pegs, the double-edged seatbelt. A currency peg is a strategy of holding a currency's price around a target level, and the goal is usually to stabilize one expectation. Lee Kuan Yew built an environment of discipline and saw stability as an asset that creates long-term, quote, trust. Pegging helps businesses predict import costs and plan better in, quote, contracts. Pegging can also reduce expected inflation if the pegged currency is credible and, quote, stable. The price is the loss of some policy freedom, as you must follow the interest rate rhythm and cycle of the, quote, anchor currency. To maintain the peg, you need foreign reserves for intervention buying and selling based on, quote, supply and demand. If reserves run dry and you still try to keep the promise, breaking the peg can cause a huge shock to, quote, expectations. In short, a currency peg is like a seatbelt. Used correctly, it saves lives. Used incorrectly, it ties your hands. 11. A common currency, the dream and the bill. The idea of a common currency sounds appealing because it reduces currency exchange costs, but it requires unifying who is responsible for, quote, one economic shock. Jean Monnet understood that deep integration always involves sharing risk and sharing, quote, discipline. When you share money, you share monetary policy. But the economic cycles of each country are not the same in, quote, reality. If a country is in recession and cannot devalue its currency independently, they lose a tool for, quote, competitive adjustment. If a country defaults, the common system is shaken because the market reprices risk based on, quote, interdependence. Therefore, a common currency needs fiscal mechanisms and budgetary discipline to avoid a, quote, breakdown. The benefit is convenience, but the price is sharing consequences and arguing over the, quote, bill. In short, a common currency is a beautiful dream, but someone always has to pay the electric bill. 12. Strong currency, strong at the right time. A strong currency is not always good, because the optimal exchange rate depends on the goals for growth, employment, and stability during one phase. Napoleon understood logistics determined the campaign, and the exchange rate is also the logistics of the economy in commerce. If the currency is too strong, exports are expensive, businesses struggle to sell, and production slows due to reduced, quote, momentum. If the currency is too weak, imports are expensive, costs rise, and imported inflation puts pressure on the cost of, quote, living. Good policy is not about making the currency the strongest, but about maintaining trust through discipline and productivity in the, quote, long run. When you hear someone boasting about a strong currency, ask, strong compared to whom, during what time frame, and in exchange for what? In short, a strong currency only matters when it serves the national strategy, not national pride. A brief conclusion and CTA about the learning community with an invitation to subscribe to the channel. If you view the quote-unquote exchange rate as a thermometer, you will stop fearing the number and begin to understand the mechanism of trust and risk. If you want me to continue this series Decoding Currency with easy-to-understand historical examples and science, join the community by hitting subscribe to the channel. See you in the next compelling video.